Okay, so today we are going to be talking about understanding human diversity in context. So the learning objectives for this lecture are to understand the importance of diversity and what diversity is, understand identity development and various acculturation models, understand the main points and objectives of oppression and liberation framework, and then understand cultural competence. And also note that the chapter that corresponds with this lecture is a fairly large chapter, so I'm going to skip over quite a few things just because that would make this lecture fairly long. So I want to hit some of the main points for this lecture, or from the chapter. So when we're thinking about human diversity, oftentimes we only think about a couple of things, right? Maybe we only think about race or ethnicity. Maybe we think about sexual orientation. But the thing about diversity is diverse, right? Hence the name. So when we're thinking about diversity, we have to think about a lot of different things that makes each individual unique. And the thing is, with this, each individual that carries something different, that aspect of that person's life is going to influence her in some way, right? So when we think about age, spirituality, and religion, where your locality, where you grew up, your ability, disability, right? So this sort of goes back to when we first talked about the first day of class, how your community influences you. That's only one aspect to diversity, and that's only one aspect to how you can be influenced as a person, right? So when we're thinking about diversity, think about the variety of things, and these are just a few of them that can really influence human behavior. But when we're thinking about diversity, when we're thinking about diversity, right, we really need to think about it in intersectional terms. And what that means is that each component makes somebody different, right? So a black straight identified male is going to live a significantly different life than a black straight identified woman, for example. Those two lives are very different. So it's not enough to say black or white or Latino, or it's not enough to say, well, this person is male or female, or this person is straight identified or gay identified, or whatever. You have to think about those terms in intersectionality, right? Also, the differences between somebody of various religious backgrounds. All of these things contribute to the not only who a person is, but also how a person experiences oppression. How a person experiences oppression within their social systems, right? And particularly in the United States social systems. So moving on a little bit, so when I'm talking about oppression in various social systems, partly we're talking about social inequality. And what social inequality is it's the lack, or maybe not the lack, but it's the permission or the withholding of others' opportunities to resources based on one of the points of diversity, right? So one of the key things of diversity. So if we think about in other countries when the Bosnian Revolution was going on, or the Bosnian War, it's the withholding of various resources from Christians or Muslims by the other group, right? When we're thinking about the United States pre-1960s, racial segregation was a huge limit to opportunities to resources, right? So it's not necessarily completely withholding various resources. What it's doing is it's withholding the opportunity to those resources. And it makes those various resources, and not just monetary resources, but maybe access to healthcare, maybe access to education. It makes those resources available to only certain groups. And so that's what we're talking about when we're talking about social inequality. We're talking about limiting others' access to various resources. And research has shown that this can lead to health disparities and other various negative outcomes, right? So in the book, I believe the book quotes a study that was done, or several studies that were done, looking at the health outcomes for black men and women, basically due and controlling for everything else, such as social economic status, education, so on and so forth, right? And they still found that that there was more negative health outcomes for black men and women, and they contributed that to various racial stereotypes, right? Racial oppression in some way. So when we're talking about diversity, this model has been developed to identify or to basically try to lay out how individuals identify with their own diversity. And so it has these three stages. So first is sort of an unexamined identity, right? So maybe when you're a child, you don't really think about who you are, where you came from, how your diversity influences your life. Then there's exploration and immersion, right? And so this is hanging out with people who are similar to yourselves, beginning to understand the social norms and group norms of the individuals from your same culture. Then it's internalization of the new formed identity. So what that means is actually incorporating those belief systems, those normative behaviors into your own behavior and into your own belief system. And then transforming relations with the mainstream culture means enabling yourself to go across outside of your own social group and begin interacting and assimilating with other cultures. And it's been found that social identities are salient for oppressed groups. So it's sort of interesting. I have friends who have done an exercise in class where they basically ask, they ask people in class to write about how race has influenced their life. And for the most part, white students have a difficult time writing about it, whereas other students can write about it fairly easily, right? And that sort of gives an indicator that that social identity and race in particular in the United States is very salient, because partly due to white privilege. Now, Barry created this model of acculturation strategies, right? And there's sort of these 4 different strategies of acculturation. And so we have here on the y-axis identification with the dominant culture. On the x-axis, we have identification with culture of origin, and weaker is on the left, stronger is on the right. For identification with dominant culture, stronger is on the top, weaker is on the bottom, right? So separation, for example, what Barry calls separation means individuals identify exclusively with their own culture of origin. So they're strong, they're on the strong side of their own culture of origin, and on the weak side of their identification with the dominant culture. So I'm not going to go into each one of these into detail. The book explains them fairly well, so I'll let you read them from there. Oh, the major note with this, however, is to note that this is not, the book has it set up in sort of a categorical type of terms. You're only assimilated, or you're only marginalized, or you're only integrated. that's not the case, right? So understand that these are a continuum. It goes from weaker to stronger on both aspects. So I can be a person who's sort of right here, right? Or I can be a person who's maybe down here a little bit. So just understand that and note that. Now we get into the meat of some of this stuff. Concepts of liberation and oppression. Now, these ideas have been mostly developed by a couple of guys. One guy named Isaac Prelatinsky at University of Miami, and another guy named Roderick Watts. I think he's in New York now. He used to be at Georgia State. But what oppression is, and how they identify it, is that a privileged group unjustly withholds power and resources from an oppressed or subordinate group, right? So when we think about that, I think segregation is the best example, and very recent example. Oppression happens a lot more subtly now than it did back, in the 1950s. In the 1950s, we had clear rules and laws and regulations against black folks using things that white people did, right? So segregation, they couldn't live on the same side of the town, they couldn't attend the same restaurants, so on and so forth, right? So that's a clear example of oppression, where again a privileged group, in this case white America, withheld power and resources from an oppressed group, and oppression happens across the diversity of characteristics, right? So white privilege is a good example, and this goes across various systems, right? So various ecological systems. It goes from the microsystem all the way up to the macrosystem. White privilege is the idea that when somebody on television, for example, is shown, or when a robbery takes place, it's often highlighting a black male doing that, whereas it's not so much the case with white. And so that's sort of a privilege that white people have, right? Patriarchy is also another example of oppression, where males have typically dominated politics, dominated business throughout history. And again, back to white privilege, if you look at Congress, for example, a person like myself, a white male, is very well shown in Congress, right? Congress is very white and very male for the most part, and it doesn't necessarily reflect the demographics of our society. And oppression can operate across a continuum, right? So you can be middle class and sort of be a privileged group compared to low-income people, but then be a sort of an oppressed or subordinate group toward wealthy people. So it sort of operates along a continuum. It's not black or white. It's not oppressed and subordinate. And additionally, it operates across multiple dimensions, right? So white women are potentially a subordinate group in one way, but then a privileged group because they're white, right? So they're subordinate in terms of patriarchy. They're privileged in terms of their whiteness. Now, oppression, again, like I mentioned, happens at various levels of analysis. So, breathing smog is this idea that accepted myths sort of infiltrate people's everyday lives, right? So we have, we all can think of them. We have a various slew of racial stereotypes that we have, stereotypes about different sexes, stereotypes about gender identity and sexual orientation, stereotypes about various religions, right? So these myths, and these myths are really important because they affect how people live. They affect people's daily lives. And this, you don't need to remember this term, but this idea of racial microaggressions, or microaggressions in general, are the sort of accumulated day-to-day myths that people continuously encounter, where they're constantly reminded, oh, I'm a person of color, or I'm gay identified, or whatever, because these myths are constantly infiltrating lives. Mass media, on the other hand, is sort of a more macro level force of oppression, right? So what mass media does is it often ignores the societal factors or the structural political factors that create oppression, and it really biases the micro level factors and tries to basically blame people or victim blame people for their own circumstances, right? So we just had this issue with Richard Sherman, where Richard Sherman was extremely passionate, just a few seconds after making a gigantic football play, one of the biggest plays of the year. And if anybody's competed in any sports, right, your adrenaline's pumping, you're kind of high on the moment in a sense, right? And so he said some things that were somewhat controversial, and so people started calling him a thug, right? And he's a black male. John McEnroe, on the other hand, is a tennis player, and he's constantly yelling, or he's retired now, but he's constantly yelling, he's constantly in refs' faces, he's throwing rackets, and you've never heard anybody call John McEnroe a thug, right? He's called passionate, he's called somebody who has a lot of passion for his sport, and he's a white male. And so this is sort of a key example of how the media can portray various races or various sexual orientations or various components of diversity different ways. And then we also have institutional oppression, right? Oppression that occurs at workplaces, at schools, enabling various components of diversity access to resources within those settings. Then we have oppression at sort of the intergroup relation level, right? So it's human tendency for people to have sort of a bias toward their own in-group and sometimes a prejudice towards out-groups. And this can occur in both dominant and oppressed groups. So the way that we really need to get around this is realizing that we have an ethnocentric bias, right? This is, in a way, human nature in a lot of ways. And we don't need to get into a big discussion about that, but we need to understand that we can see terms in our own ethnocentric bias and identify that bias. And by identifying that bias, we're able to move forward in another direction. So we need to label it and then move forward on it and try to break down those barriers of intergroup relationships, of negative intergroup relationships. So the main points here of liberation and oppression that I really want you to take away is systems of oppression are to blame, not individuals. So what I mean by systems of oppression are the policies that are created that withhold resources and access to resources from certain groups. It's the social norms, right? It's those stereotypes. It's the way we act toward people of a different group. These things need to be changed, not the individuals, right? We don't need to change individuals. We need to shift the social norms. We need to shift the policies. And so, in essence, we need to shift structural change, right? We need to shift how relationships work, how power works, how access to resources work. That's what we need to shift in order to become liberated. Also, members of privileged groups do not consent to the system, right? So these systems of oppression are set up to benefit certain people and certain groups. And members of those privileged groups don't always agree to that system, right? So as a white male, I didn't agree that whiteness is beneficial for me. I didn't agree that being a male is beneficial for me. I didn't agree that being a straight male is beneficial for me. But it is in a lot of ways. So I didn't consent to that, right? And similarly, members of oppressed group aren't necessarily powerless as well. There's things that members of oppressed groups can do to create structural change. And finally, I think a really important point here is that systems of oppression, and this is highlighted more deeply in some of the journal articles that Preletinsky and Watts have written, But systems of oppression are oppressive to both the dominant and subordinate groups, right? And it's sort of weird to think about this, but the dominant groups, although they benefit by having access to resources, there's particular things that people of those groups need to do to uphold those systems. Not everybody, but a lot of people do. And there's various social norms that go around acting in a certain way, right? So as a straight white male, there's sort of an expectation of me to act a certain way. And until we can destroy and sort of break down those systems of oppression, I'm going to be looked upon to act a certain way, even though it's beneficial for me. I may not like that, and it may still be in some weird ways oppressive. So what we need to do is, by dismantling some of these systems of oppression, it will liberate not only the subordinate groups, but it also liberates dominant groups as well. I'm going to move forward. I'm going to let you read these sections on cultural competence. Basically, the general idea is that, as I mentioned before, we need to understand various cultures, and we need to label our own prejudice and label our own stereotypes, and try to move forward from that. But identifying that is important. So I'll let you read that section. I'll also let you read these two culturally anchored community programs. I'll let you get into that stuff. It's you should be able to get into it fairly easily. So what we need to take from this is, that should not be there. Conclusion: in what ways is diversity manifested? How does intersectionality play a part? So after hearing this, you should know these things. How do individuals examine their cultural identities? What are the main points of oppression and liberation framework? How do societies liberate themselves from oppressive systems, and in what ways can societies become culturally competent, right? So from this, take away the main points of liberation for sure. Liberation and oppression. What is liberation and oppression? What is diversity? These are important things to understand when moving forward.